Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word, excuse me, the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Matthew chapter 21, where we are in the last week of Jesus. You can say the last week of Jesus' public ministry, and we are and so in chapter 21, we had his what's commonly known as the triumphal entry. The significance of that, when they say triumphal, I don't know kind of where they got that from. It's more declarative. Um, when it said that he rode in, I don't know where the particular phrase triumphal come in. I don't know if it's a theological term or not. But excuse me, the the significance of that is after all of the miracles, Jesus presents himself as the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. After all of the miracles that he displayed, remember, we're at the end of his public ministry. For 3.5 years, the teachings, the miracles, okay, all of the healings, right? So we come to the end, and when he rides through on the mule, he's declaring his to the Jewish people that he's the Messiah. Okay, that he's declaring that, and so it gets, in a sense, you can say it gets a little worse before it gets better, because the same crowd would then reject him just a few days later. So let's get to it. What is called the triumphal entry. I'm going to come back to this. I found this in the last video I did. I kept saying that I couldn't remember the term vineyard. I'll come back to that, and I forgot I had this nice little Bible aid, and then I'll come back to that page you just saw. So anyway, so Jesus rides through, and the people are yelling, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They're throwing their palms and branches before him, and they're declaring this. Now, the thing is, they just don't really mean it in their heart, as we will see later. And then he goes into the temple. He drive out the money changers, and he says, my house is called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves." And then he heals the people. He heals the people came to him, and they was healed in the temple. Again, they were merchandising in the temple. Sound familiar? Okay, just turn on any Christian TV show and you see merchandising, right? And in fact, a lot of these Christian TV shows today exist. They will tell you it exists to preach the gospel. It exists to merchandise. This is why you always have them merchandising. They're going to sell their books, their products, advertise their meetings, okay? And so the TV shows are simply to merchandise, okay? And but yet Jesus demonstrated again what the temple was actually meant to be, a house of prayer. People were being ministered to. All right, I'm going to pick up verse 17. It says, "Then he left them and went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. Early in the morning, as he was returning to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he went up to it and found nothing on it, except leaves. And he said to it, 'May no fruit ever come from you again.' And at once the fig tree withered. And when the disciples saw it, they were amazed and said, 'How did the fig tree wither so quickly?' Now, one of the interesting things about this story, I have to say, as Matthew is telling the story, he tells it in a more condensed version, because once we get to, like, for example, Mark, we're going to see that they went someplace and overnight he spent the night, and when they came back the next day, the fig tree had withered. Okay, so so now they said, wow. Now they saw him speak to this fig tree and says, may no fruit ever come from you ever. And again, and the way, I guess, I've never seen a fig tree, but as what should have been, there should have been fruit, and all he saw was leaves. Now, and it's also it's a symbol. If you go back and you remember, Jesus talks about fruit. The one thing you will see that he always talks about, and what he's always bothered by, is a lack of fruit. Right? In other words, he even says that about our lives. Are we bearing fruit? If we're not bearing fruit, that's going to be most displeasing to the Lord. Now, verse 21 says, and Jesus answered them, I assure you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what is done to the fig tree, but even if you tell this mountain, be lifted up and thrown into the sea, it will be done. And if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. And I think the last statement clarifies what Jesus means about having faith. And then he says that you can speak to a mountain. I'll probably elaborate more on this when we get to Mark's gospel. And the idea is, there has been a teaching, a sort of movement that teaches that faith is a force, and that words are the container of the force, that if you speak, that the power of faith is in your words. And so this teaching, it's kind of waning now, but it's really, really popular, that if you just speak, you have to have it, though. That's not what Jesus is conveying, because you don't see any of the apostles speaking to mountains. So what is the meaning when he says, if you have faith? First of all, we kind of have to understand what the nature of faith is. Faith is in God. So, for example, when you look at all of the examples of people who exercise faith, that it was always done they were following God's command. So, for example, when Jesus was walking on the water, and you saw the boats, the apostles in the boats, and when they saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. And Jesus says, do not be afraid, it is I. And then Peter said, Lord, if it is you, bid me come walking on the water. Jesus said, come. So that was the source of faith there. Peter just didn't get up and go, you know what? I got faith. I'm going to get out here and walk on the water. That wasn't the source, see? But once Jesus said, come, then Peter started walking on the water. And of course, the irony of it is that he started looking at the storms and began to think. He looked at the storms instead of when Jesus said, come, which the idiot, the lunacy of that was, what did the wind have to do with you walking on the water? Okay. So that's kind of the context there. And again, people sell books. Again, it's a whole movement out here that kind of people, kind of believe, if I just have enough faith, I could do whatever. No, your faith is in God. All right. Verse 23 says, and when he entered the temple complex, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority? Now, if you go back, remember, he just drove out the money changers. Now he's saying to them, so now they're saying, by what authority are you doing this? Now, again, this is sort of kind of a trick question. They were always trying to trick him to say that he was the Messiah. Because if he said that, I'm the Messiah, I'm the king, they would haul him to Pilate and said, hey, he's committing treason. Now, as it stands, they're going to lie and say that anyway, but this is what they're trying to do. So Jesus said, verse 24, and Jesus answered them, and I would also ask you a question. If you answer it for me, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Where did John's baptism come from? From heaven or from men? And watch this. So they began to argue among themselves. If we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say from men, we're afraid of the crowds because everyone thought John was a prophet. So they answered, we don't know. Now, in that, they lied because in this reasoning, they affirm what they already knew about John the Baptist, that he was a true prophet of God. And so he said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. But, notice now, what do you think? A man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, my son, go work in my vineyard today. Now, you have to understand the imagery, and this is why I'm going to go back to this here. And I want to show you this thing here. So when you see the term vineyard, so this is, again, I like, a lot of these, again, Bible apps. We live in a wonderful day where we have these kind of Bible apps. And I just kind of typed up the word vineyard. And I know it was in Isaiah someplace, but I just couldn't find it. But in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7. Now watch this. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. And he looked for judgment, but behold, oppression, for righteousness, but behold, a cry. Now I just want you to see, when you see vineyard, how that the term vineyard is so the imagery, he's talking about Israel. And then he says, a man had 2 sons. He went to the first and said, my son, go work in my vineyard. Okay. So again, the imagery here, we'll see this later in Matthew 24 in terms of Matthew 25. Again, we're talking about Israel. He answered, I don't want to. Yet later he changed his mind and went. Then the man went to the other son and said the same thing. I will, sir, he answered, but he didn't go. But which of the 2 did his father's will? The first, they said. Now, you will know as Jesus is conversing with them, remember the scribes and the elders and the Pharisees are not dumb people. They know the scriptures. This will make their sin even more grievous. By the way, in all of our lives when it comes to sin, we may put on this pretense, like we're kind of good people and all that. But when you peel this all away, when you peel all that away, you really come back to, oh, we're just like them. And you'll get to the point that the Pharisees get to a point where they're just going to totally disregard the goodness of God in favor of their, again, sinfulness. You notice they're able to converse with Jesus. They wasn't ignorant. They wasn't dumb. They wasn't in the dark. They are sinning. And I often say this too about the Pharisees. It's not that they were confused about Jesus. They knew exactly who Jesus is, but they rejected him. They knew he is the Messiah. They knew he fits all of the prophecies. They rejected it. That is how you can say how bad sin is. Now Jesus said to them, I assure you, tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God before you. Now let's stop, because again, why he's not just saying that tax collectors and prostitutes were entering the kingdom of God just because, But why will tax collectors and prostitutes, these sinners? And this is a great insult to the Pharisees because remember, they were the measure of piety back then. If you were living back then and you saw Pharisees, you would be like, that's a holy man. Those people are holy. And here Jesus is saying tax collectors, the lowliest of people, and prostitute, the lowliest of people, the lowliest of sinners. He says the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God before you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness. They knew that. And you didn't believe him. Tax collectors and prostitutes did believe him. But you, when you saw it, didn't even change your minds then and believe him. But here's the thing. Understand, they knew who Jesus was. They knew who John the Baptist was. Verse 33, he says, listen to another parable. And by the way, a parable was a story, a truth that was told in a story form so that people can easily grasp its meaning. He said there was a man, and usually the parable, by the way, usually parables kind of related to, let's say, the situation or the crowd that Jesus was speaking to. He said there was a man, a landowner, who planted a what? Vineyard. Now again, remember, when we see this term vineyard here, we're talking about what? The nation of Israel. So the illustration here, the parable, the illustration then is talking about Israel. And you go all the way back to history and you'll see how this fits in the prophetic prophecies. The nation of Israel as God's vineyard. For the man, a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. He leased it out to tenant farmers and went away. When the grape harvest drew near, he sent his slaves to the farmers to collect his fruit. But the farmers took his slaves, beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Yet again he sent other slaves, more than the first group, and they did the same thing. Finally, he said, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenant farmers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and take the inheritance. So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. So, right, great imagery. Remember, just days before that the Pharisees will actually do this. So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those farmers? Notice their reply. He will completely destroy those terrible men, they told him, and lease his vineyard to other farmers who will give him his produce at the harvest. Now, in saying this, they actually are convicting themselves. They're actually telling on themselves. So he says, verse 42, then Jesus said, have you never read the scriptures that the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This came from the Lord, and it is wonderful in your eyes. Therefore, I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing its fruit. Whoever falls on the stones will be broken, but on whoever it falls, it will grind in the powder. Now, this last phrase here, let me say verse 44 in parentheses, and remember when you see that, it just simply means in other manuscripts this wasn't found. Now, but notice again, Jesus just kind of just blasts them. Watch this, verse 45. And when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard this parable, they knew he was speaking about them. Think about that. They knew this. Again, they wasn't dummies. They wasn't men that didn't know. They absolutely knew the scriptures. He says, although they were looking for a way to arrest him, they feared the crowd because they regarded him as a prophet. Now, one of the things that they always, again, there was a couple of reasons why they didn't want a crowd. Again, you never want riots, right? Remember January 6th? All right, when you look at January 6th, all right. Well, there was another reason why the Pharisees kind of did not want a riot, because remember, one of the reasons that the Pharisees were installed by Rome, okay, was to keep order. One of the things they were tasked so that if things got out of control, one, the government will disband them. They wouldn't enjoy, their prestige. They wouldn't enjoy their clout. They wouldn't enjoy their power and their authority. And that's why they had to be very careful, because if you came to if Jesus if they insulted Jesus the wrong way, then the crowds at that moment would rebel. Okay, the crowd at that moment would rebel. But again, another fantastic story here. How again you see the hardness of the Pharisees. The hardness of the Pharisees. Just how hard-hearted they are, and that's why Jesus even said to them, "Hey, you're not going to go to heaven because of your hardness, how sinful you are." All right, guys, we'll pick this up in the next, in actually chapter 22, in the next study. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.